On a winter night in 39 AD, the city of Rome froze. It was not because of the temperature, it was because of the silence. If you had been there walking the streets that night, you would have felt it. A heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on the rooftops of the 7 hills. The usual sounds of the capital, like the drunken shouting from the taverns, or the rattle of carts, or the arguments of merchants, had vanished. In the noble district up on the Palatine Hill and the slopes surrounding it, the silence was even heavier. It was the silence of people listening inside the great marble villas behind heavy oak doors and curtains of thick tapestry. Families were awake. Fathers stood by the atrium staring at the entryway. Mothers sat in the back rooms holding their children so tightly it left marks on their skin. They were not waiting for a storm. They were not waiting for a foreign army. They were listening for the sound of sandals on stone. Imagine being 14 years old. You were lying in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to count the seconds between your own heartbeats. You have grown up in the most powerful city on earth. You have been told that to be a Roman is to be free, to be the master of the world. But tonight, you feel like prey. Then you hear it. At the end of the street comes the rhythmic metallic crunch of hobnail boots. The Praetorian Guard. The sound gets louder, echoing off the stone walls of the alleyways. You pray they walk past. You bargain with gods you have not spoken to in years. Let them pass. Let them go to the neighbor's house. Not us. Please, not us. But the footsteps stop right in front of your gate. There is no shouting, no banging on the door, just a heavy, confident knock. The knock of men who know they do not need to ask for permission because they already own everything they see. When your father opens the door, the cold night air rushes in, carrying the smell of torch smoke. Standing there is a centurion, his armor gleaming under the light of a lantern covered in red cloth. He does not draw his sword. He does not have to. He simply hands your father a scroll sealed with purple wax. Your father breaks the seal, his hands shaking so badly he nearly drops it. He reads the words, and you see the life drain out of his face. He looks old suddenly, defeated. He turns to look at you standing in the shadows of the hallway, and he tries to smile. It is the worst smile you have ever seen. It is a smile that says, "I cannot save you." The scroll is an invitation, but in 39 AD, an invitation from Emperor Caligula is not a request, it is a summons. And for the young women of the nobility, it is a death sentence that arrives wearing perfume. Tonight, you are going to the palace. You are going to a place they whisper about in the markets, but dare not name aloud. A place where the emperor has decided that the daughters of the Senate are no longer citizens, but currency. Welcome to the Garden of Venus. To understand why you are standing there freezing in your nightgown, waiting to be taken away by soldiers, you have to understand the man who sent them. You have to understand how a human soul can rot so thoroughly that it becomes something else entirely. Caligula was not born a monster. In fact, he was born a miracle. His real name was Gaius, and he was the son of Germanicus. If you lived in Rome back then, the name Germanicus meant everything. He was the golden general, the hero who reclaimed the honor of the empire, the man who was supposed to save Rome from tyranny. He was handsome and brave and good, and his little son Gaius was the mascot of the army. Picture a 2-year-old boy toddling through the mud of a military camp on the Rhine frontier. Thousands of hardened legionaries, men who killed for a living, would stop and cheer when they saw him. They made him a tiny custom-fitted soldier's uniform, complete with miniature sandals. The Latin word for a soldier's boot is caliga, so they gave him a nickname, Little Boot, Caligula. It was adorable. It was innocent. But look closer at that childhood. This boy did not grow up with toys. He grew up with weapons.
He did not fall asleep to lullabies. He fell asleep to the sounds of blacksmiths sharpening swords and men screaming in the medical tents. He learned to walk on ground soaked in blood, and he watched his father command legions with a single word. The first lesson Caligula learned was not love, it was power. He learned that if you are strong enough, thousands of men will die for you. But if you are weak, you are nothing. That lesson was burned into him when he was 7 years old. His father, the great Germanicus, died in Syria. It was not a glorious death on the battlefield. It was slow, agonizing, and suspicious. He wasted away, his skin turning black, foaming at the mouth, convinced he was being poisoned by the agents of the Emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died, the world collapsed for Caligula. The protection of the legions was gone. He was just a 7-year-old boy in a city run by the murderers of his father. For the next few years, he watched his family be systematically hunted down. His mother, Agrippina, was a woman of iron will who refused to be silent, so the Emperor Tiberius had her beaten so effortlessly that she lost an eye. Then she was exiled to a tiny island called Pandataria when she tried to starve herself to death in protest. Soldiers forced her mouth open and poured food down her throat because the emperor was not ready to let her die yet. She eventually succeeded, dying of starvation in the dark. Caligula's 2 older brothers were destroyed too. One was declared an enemy of the state and hunted until he committed suicide. The other was imprisoned in the palace basement, reduced to eating the stuffing of his mattress before he finally starved. And Caligula was the spare, the youngest, the one nobody worried about. He survived by becoming invisible. He learned that showing emotion got you killed. If he cried for his mother, he was a traitor. If he looked angry about his brothers, he was a threat. So he killed the parts of himself that could feel. He buried his grief, his rage, and
his humanity deep inside a mental fortress where no one could find them. But the final test of his sanity happened on the island of Capri. When Caligula was a teenager, the Emperor Tiberius, the man who had destroyed his entire family, summoned him to live on his private island. Capri is beautiful, stunning cliffs, blue water, lemon groves, but under Tiberius it was a house of horrors. The old emperor had retired there to indulge in his darkest, most perverse fantasies away from the eyes of Rome. And he wanted Caligula there with him. Imagine the psychological torture. Every morning Caligula had to wake up, walk into the breakfast chamber, and smile at the man who killed his mother. He had to laugh at the jokes of the emperor. He had to watch people be tortured for the amusement of Tiberius and act like he did not care. The historians tell us that Caligula was a master actor. He never cracked, not once. He was so obedient, so servile, that a famous orator later said of him that there was never a better servant and never a worse master. But Tiberius knew the old man was paranoid, but he was not stupid. He would look at the young Caligula, watching the way the eyes of the boy were dead and cold, and he would whisper to his astrologers that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people. He knew what was growing inside the boy. He knew that all that repressed rage, all that swallowed trauma was not disappearing. It was fermenting. It was turning into a poison that would one day drown the world. For 6 years, Caligula lived in that golden cage. He learned that human beings are disposable. He learned that morality is a lie told by the weak to protect themselves from the strong. And he learned that the only way to be safe is to be the one holding the whip. When Tiberius finally died in 37 A.D., the pressure cooker exploded. Caligula became emperor. He was 24 years old. Rome went hysterical with joy. They did not see the broken survivor from Capri. They saw the son of Germanicus. They saw the little boy in the boots of a soldier. They thought the golden age had returned, and for the first 7 months it seemed like they were right.
Caligula was perfect. He burned the records of the treason trials. He recalled exiles. He poured money into games and feasts. He was young, charming, and generous. The people called him their star and their baby. But it was a mask. The boy from Capri was just playing another role. He was acting the part of the good emperor because that is what he thought he had to do. Then, in October of 37 A.D., he got sick. It was a violent, sudden illness. Historians debate what it was, but for weeks he hovered between life and death. The people of Rome slept in the streets outside the palace, praying for him to survive. But the man who woke up from that fever was not the man who lay down. Something in his brain had snapped, or perhaps the illness stripped away the last of his inhibitions. The filter was gone. The actor walked off the stage, and the monster walked on. He looked around his palace and realized a terrifying truth. I can do anything. There were no rules. If he wanted to kill the consul, he could. If he wanted to dissolve the Senate, he could. If he wanted to declare himself a god, who was going to stop him? He started small. He ordered his teenage cousin to commit suicide because he coughed at the dinner table, and Caligula found it annoying. He forced his father-in-law to cut his own throat with a razor. But simple murder was not enough. He needed to humiliate. He needed to prove that he was above every law, every custom, and every god. He spent money like water. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae just to ride a horse across it, proving a soothsayer wrong. He dissolved pearls in vinegar and drank them, and within a year the treasury of Rome, which had taken Tiberius 20 years to fill, was empty, bankrupt. The empire was broke. But Caligula did not panic. He smiled. He looked at the rich, proud, moralizing senators of Rome, the men who judged him, the men who whispered about him, and he saw a way to solve his money problems and satisfy his hatred at the same time. He would not just tax them, he would break them. This brings us back to the knock on the door. Caligula declared that the palace was opening a new wing. He called it a place of public service, a place to raise revenue for the state. He seized a massive section of the imperial residence and furnished it with the most expensive luxuries in the empire. Silk curtains from the east, couches inlaid with ivory, gold statues, exotic incense. It looked like a temple to Venus, the goddess of love, but it was not a temple. It was a brothel. And the staff meant to work there were not slaves bought from the market. He did not hire common prostitutes. He sent his praetorian guards into the homes of the consul, the praetors, the highest-ranking knights of Rome. He demanded their wives. He demanded their daughters. Let us go back to the girl. Let us call her Flavia. When Flavia arrived at the palace that night, she was separated from her father. She was taken into the labyrinth of the Palatine, down corridors that smelled of roses and rot. She was brought into a changing room filled with other women she recognized. There was the wife of a general she had seen at the Forum. There was the daughter of the best friend of her father. They were all silent, their eyes wide and glassy like animals caught in a trap. The servants stripped them of their noble stolets, the modest robes that marked them as respectable Roman women. They were dressed in diaphanous silks, transparent and flimsy. They were painted with makeup used by streetwalkers. Then they were led into the garden. It was a series of rooms open to the public, but the public here meant anyone with money. Caligula had sent heralds into the squares of Rome, inviting commoners, freemen, soldiers, and merchants to come to the palace. Come, the heralds cried, and satisfy your lusts with the dignity of the Senate. Flavia was forced to stand in a cubicle under a sign that listed her price. Imagine the shame.
Roman culture, the modesty of a woman was her life. It was the honor of her entire family. To be seen like this was a fate worse than death. But the horror was not just sexual, it was psychological. Caligula did not hide in his private quarters. He was there.
He walked through the brothel like a floor manager, chatting with the customers. He would stand by the door, shouting encouragement to the men, thanking them for contributing to the revenue of Caesar. He played the role of a pimp. The emperor of Rome, the most powerful man on earth, reduced the mothers and daughters of his aristocracy to merchandise, and he collected the coins himself. He did this to show the Senate that they were nothing. You think you are noble, he was saying, but you are meat. You are mine. And Flavia stood there, freezing in the drafty corridor, while strange men looked at her, haggled over her, touched her. She scanned the crowd, terrified she might see someone she knew, a neighbor, a shopkeeper she bought bread from. But the worst moment came later. Caligula was not satisfied with just the brothel. He needed the husbands and fathers to participate in their own destruction. So he held banquets. He would invite the very men whose wives and daughters were currently enslaved in the next wing of the palace. He forced them to come to dinner. To refuse was treason. Picture the scene, a long table laden with exotic food like peacock tongues and dormice dipped in honey and vintage wine. At the head of the table reclined Caligula, wearing a silk robe and a necklace of pearls, picking at his food, watching. Down the table sat the father of Flavia. He had to eat, he had to drink, he had to make conversation. Suddenly Caligula would stand up, the music would stop, the room would go deadly silent. The emperor would walk out of the dining hall and disappear into the brothel wing. The guests would sit there in the silence, staring at their plates. They could hear sounds through the walls. Or maybe just the silence was enough. 10 minutes would pass, 20. Then Caligula would return. He would not just sit down. He would loudly critique the performance of the woman he had just been with. He would describe her body, her habits, her reluctance, her enthusiasm. He would look directly at her husband across the table and give him a review. And the husband had to smile. If he looked down, he would be executed. If he clenched his fist, he would be executed. If he shed a tear, he would be executed. There was a story of a nobleman named Pastor. Caligula executed his son that morning. That evening he invited Pastor to dinner. Caligula spent the entire meal making jokes about the death of the boy, laughing, toasting to his memory. Pastor drank every toast. He laughed at every joke. He betrayed the memory of his son with every breath. Why did he do it? Because he had another son at home, and he knew that if he stopped smiling, Caligula would kill that one too. This was the true genius of the terror of Caligula. He did not just kill people, he made them complicit in their own humiliation. He turned the Senate of Rome into a room full of cowards who hated themselves more than they hated him. But terror is a fragile thing. You can push a man until he breaks, but if you push him past the break, sometimes you find something hard and sharp underneath. Caligula made one fatal mistake. He forgot that even dogs will bite if you kick them enough. He turned his mockery toward the people who held the swords, the Praetorian Guard, specifically a tribune named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was a career soldier. He was old school. He had served under Germanicus. He was a man of iron and blood, a man who had survived brutal campaigns on the frontier, but he had a high-pitched voice. Caligula thought this was hilarious. Every day when Chaerea came to the emperor to ask for the watchword, the password of the day for the guard, Caligula would give him an obscene word. He would make this hardened veteran say things like Venus, implying he was a woman, or Priapus, the god of erections. When Chaerea would extend his hand for the emperor to kiss his ring, a traditional sign of respect, Caligula would form his hand into a sexual gesture and wave it in the face of the soldier, wiggling his fingers. It was juvenile, it was petty, but to a Roman soldier, it was unforgivable. Day after day, the humiliation ground down on Chaerea. The other soldiers snickered, the emperor laughed, but Chaerea stopped laughing. He looked at this boy, this 29-year-old psychopath who had never fought a battle in his life, and he decided that Rome had had enough. He began to whisper, not to the senators because they were too scared. He whispered to the other guards, to the men who carried the weapons. "Are we men," he asked them, "or are we slaves to the whims of a madman?" The conspiracy grew. It was not about politics anymore. It was not about restoring the republic. It was about manhood. It was about vengeance. They picked a date, January 24th, 41 A.D., the Palatine Games. The morning of the 24th was stuffy and hot. The theater was packed. Caligula was there, watching the plays, laughing, throwing fruit at the crowd. He was in high spirits. He had just finished a sacrifice where the blood of a flamingo had splashed onto his toga, which was an omen of death, but he did not care. He felt immortal. Around noon, Caligula decided to leave the theater to take a bath and have some lunch. His uncle Claudius and the other courtiers suggested he go up the main road, but Caligula, ever impulsive, chose a shortcut. He turned toward the Crypto Orticus. The Crypto Orticus is still there in Rome today. It is an
underground corridor, a long, dim tunnel beneath the palaces. It is cool and damp, shutting out the noise of the city. Caligula walked in, surrounded by a small group of German bodyguards, but he waved them ahead. He stopped to talk to some young noble boys from Asia who were rehearsing a dance for the evening performance. This was the moment Cassius Chaereas stepped out of the shadows. He did not make a speech. He did not declare the Republic restored. He looked the emperor in the eye, the man who had called him a woman, the man who had turned Rome into a whorehouse, and he drew his sword. Caligula looked confused. He started to speak. Chaereas swung. The blade bit deep into underground corridor, a long, dim tunnel beneath the palaces. It is cool and damp, shutting out the noise of the city. Caligula walked in, surrounded by a small group of German bodyguards, but he waved them ahead. He stopped to talk to some young noble boys from Asia who were rehearsing a dance for the evening performance. This was the moment Cassius Chaereas stepped out of the shadows. He did not make a speech. He did not declare the Republic restored. He looked the emperor in the eye, the man who had called him a woman, the man who had turned Rome into a whorehouse, and he drew his sword. Caligula looked confused. He started to speak. Chaereas swung. The blade bit deep into the neck of Caligula, slicing through the jawbone. The emperor did not die instantly. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat, gurgling. He screamed, "I am still alive!" A last desperate attempt to command reality, to claim that he was a god and could not die. But the other conspirators swarmed him. They did not just stab him, they hacked at him. 30 wounds. They tore at his flesh with the fury of men who had been holding their breath for 4 years. They stabbed him in the chest, the groin, in the face. The god of Rome died in a puddle of his own filth on the floor of a dark tunnel, crying for help that never came. But if you think this is the happy ending, you have not been paying attention to how Rome works. When a tyrant dies, the world does not automatically become good. It becomes chaotic. The German bodyguards, huge men loyal only to Caligula, heard the screams. They came running back into the tunnel. When they saw their master dead, they went berserk. They did not care about politics. They just knew their meal ticket was gone. They drew their swords and stormed the palace. They hacked down the conspirators, but then they kept killing. They killed innocent senators who were just walking by. They killed servants. And in the Garden of Venus, the terror reached its peak. Flavia and the other women heard the screaming. Then they heard the heavy boots running through the halls. Imagine the panic, locked in the brothel wing, listening to the slaughter getting closer. Was this a rescue, or was it a purge? They huddled in the corners of the silk-lined rooms, clutching the jewelry they were forced to wear. The doors burst open. Some were killed in the confusion. Others were dragged out by soldiers who took advantage of the anarchy. The palace became a slaughterhouse. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, a soldier noticed a pair of feet sticking out from behind the curtain. He pulled the fabric back and found Claudius, the uncle of Caligula. The old man was shaking, terrified. He was next. Instead, the soldier grinned and saluted, saying, "Hail, Emperor!" They did not want a republic. They wanted another paycheck. They carried Claudius to the camp and proclaimed him ruler. And what about Flavia? What about the women of the garden? When the dust settled, when Claudius established order,
The doors of the palace were opened. The women were sent home. But this was not a liberation. It was a final, crushing humiliation. They walked out of the palace, back into the sunlight of Rome. They walked through the streets they had grown up in. But the people did not look at them with pity. They looked at them with shame. Fathers turned away when their daughters returned. Husbands refused to look their wives in the eye. Because in Rome it did not matter that you were forced. It did not matter that the emperor held a sword to your throat. You were damaged. You were impure. You were a living reminder of the cowardice of the family. The Senate passed no laws to help these women. There were no therapists, no support groups. There was only silence. Rome did what it always did with its sins. It buried them. The families took their daughters back, but they hid them. Flavia would have been confined to the back rooms of the villa of her father. She would never marry. She would never attend public festivals again. She was a ghost in her own home. She would spend the rest of her life flinching at loud noises, waking up screaming from nightmares of heavy footsteps and silk curtains. And every time she looked at her father, she would remember the night he smiled at the centurion. And he would remember the night he drank wine while Caligula described her body. They never spoke of it. The Garden of Venus was dismantled. The silks were burned. The history books barely mention it, focusing instead on the politics and the wars. We like to think of history as a list of dates and battles. We like to think of Caligula as a cartoon villain, a crazy guy who made his horse a priest. It makes him easier to digest. But the reality of Caligula is much darker because it involves bus. Caligula did not build the Garden of Venus with his own hands. He did not guard the doors himself. He did not cook the food at the banquets. Thousands of normal people did that. Soldiers, servants, bureaucrats, nobles. They watched it happen. They participated. They looked away. Rome was the greatest civilization on earth. It had laws, philosophy, art. And yet it allowed a single damaged young man to turn its daughters into currency and its leaders into cowards. The story of the Garden of Venus is not just a story about a mad emperor. It is a story about the fragility of civilization. It shows us how quickly the rules we think protect us can vanish when power goes unchecked. It asks us a terrifying question. How much would you tolerate to stay alive? If the knock came to your door tonight, if the scroll was placed in your hand, would you be the hero? Would you fight the legion?